Under a video called A Simple Argument for Moral Realism, I've been having a comments discussion with Ivan the Heathen. And if you haven't checked out his channel, I'd highly recommend it. He has a lot of good videos, although I don't believe he's uploaded in the last year. Especially check out his Theological Origins of Modernity series, which is based off a book by a guy named Gillespie. And that focuses on the debates between nominalism and realism in the medieval period, and then the cascading influence of those disputes throughout Western intellectual history. So you can go ahead and read through this full conversation. It would take you a while, and I don't have time to do all of that now. Honestly, I think he argued his position better up front. But ultimately, obviously, I think I am right. So by the time we get towards the end, hopefully you'll understand exactly what the nature of this disagreement is. And I've also made some visual tools to help grasp the underlying disagreement. But I'm just going to read through this last reply, which was 1 month ago, and stop and break and address the things as they come up. So I apologize for taking so long to get back to you. What you've said here is certainly worthy of a reply. Well, I believe between my last reply and this was like 2 weeks, and I've been a month, so I'm twice as bad. I apologize doubly. Rather than starting this off in the usual pattern of quoting sections of your comment and responding in sequence, let me start with a global point. Throughout, you repeatedly say that there is something about sense experience that indubitably, or at least reliably, grounds thought, and that reaching out for concepts with the mind alone cannot enable you to grasp concepts with the same degree of confidence or certainty. Well, I wouldn't say that sense experience indubitably grounds thought in general. What I would say is that concepts are composed of factors of experience. So if I see an object that has a property that appears in multiple places on the object, like a color that reoccurs, then I can abstract that color and have a concept of that color, like the color blue. So the sense experience, I can point back to the sense experience as the referent of the concept. To think of it linguistically is a little bit easier. All I'm saying is that to have, and it's not actually all I'm saying, but mostly what I'm saying is to have a valid concept, you have to have a valid reference to something that is immediately given. It's not just language. Right? Language is all concerned with acts of reference to something non-linguistic, or at least at face value non-linguistic, something perceptual or something phenomenological in the broadest sense. So it's not that sense experience indubitably grounds thought in general. It's that we take as a basis some form of experience and abstract from that a concept which refers to the class of experiences. Of course, we only think about the class by the name that we give it and the particular remembered events which embody it. But because there's some sort of eidetic similarity across multiple events, filtering through several instances of the color blue in your mind is good enough to give you something that seems like there's a constant relation across time. It's an invariant representation. Okay, so yeah, and that reaching out for concepts with the mind alone cannot enable you to grasp concepts with the same degree of confidence or certainty. What it would mean to grasp with the mind alone without sense experience, and remember, I'm not just talking about sense experience, I'm talking about phenomenological contents broadly, so qualia in general. Without qualia, without something pre-conceptual, like conceptual play of the mind doesn't seem to exist. I can't imagine a set of concepts floating around being intelligible unless those concepts have some kind of perceptual underpinning. You repeatedly insist that if a concept isn't anchored in sense experience, you just can't be sure that it's a genuine concept. Yeah, again, it's not that it has to be sense experience per se. Like you could have a brain in a vat and you could download contents for its imagination and conceptual generation, and that brain could then play around with those downloaded contents. Or it could come pre-loaded. It could be genetically encoded that it has certain basic archetypes that are phenomenologically given for it. And with those given phenomenological materials, it could then abstract regularities across the class of a priori archetypes. So something like a transcendental phenomenological analysis, like Kant's analysis, would be sufficient for generating concepts. Like causality, do we generate that concept from sense experience? It's not clear. Not sensation alone. Sensation alone, the sequence of action potentials generated from our sense organs, that doesn't give us a concept of causality. In order to have the concept of causality, actually, in order to have perception, we already have to have causality somehow built into us. And so it's an intuition. It's something basic, and we can like describe the meaning of it in a visceral sense, in a pre-conceptual way. So it's what I'm looking for in the groundwork of a concept is something that's understood at a more visceral level, not a conceptual level, because all language, anything you're going to articulate as a concept is going to be through language. It's going to refer to something else. An unending sequence of reference is not going to help anyone understand. To understand something, you have to point the reference back to something more immediately given, like the kind of understanding that an animal would have, like an understanding of causality. Now, it doesn't conceptualize causality, but that's a mental content that if it had reason, then it could generate the concept of causality. I've read through your comment multiple times to try and tease out your reasons for thinking this. I have to say, though, no matter how many times I read through what you've said, I can't detect an actual argument for this proposition anywhere. I think that's slightly less than generous. The more times I read through your comments, the more persuaded I become that this is just a prejudice on your part. Part of it may be that I see it as almost self-evident, and so maybe I'm not arguing it in full. And if you wanted to see where I'm getting the basis of this argument, it's not restricted to this, but it's Schopenhauer's On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, which I've already recommended in this thread to him. I also offered to read a book of his recommendation, but in any case, so let's look at it etymologically. Like the question here is, what is a concept? At a certain level, my argument can be interpreted as from definition. And the definition of a concept that I have is an aggregation of percepts, abstracted from percepts. So let's look at the etymology from concipio, con, and capio. Capio meaning to capture, also to understand, and con meaning with. So a together understanding, putting understandings of various things together. And let's oppose that to a perception, percipio, and per is through, capio, capture, seize, understand, and to through understand is to understand through our a priori form of causality. In order to have perception, that is perception of objects, of particular objects, we have to filter sensation, which is prior to perception, through the a priori intuition of causality that we possess. If you couldn't infer causal origins to sensation, then vision would be like a mat of color, basically. You couldn't perceive depth. In order to have perception, we have to filter the captured sensation through the understanding. I think this etymologically makes sense, and it makes sense with how people actually use these terms. So, and then what is a concept? According to a standard definition, a concept is a generalization or abstraction from experience or the result of a transformation of existing ideas. Right, so you have a concept being abstracted from experience. You have multiple entities, and from that you abstract regularities and then have a name for this set of regularities found from disparate original percepts. That's the definition of a concept that makes sense to me, that's coherent to me, and I don't have an alternative definition being laid down by Ivan here, unless I missed it, but I'm fairly sure I don't have a rigorous definition of a concept otherwise. So it's a little bit like the way that I use the word concept requires that it be originated from an abstraction from percepts. And so in order to have a valid concept, I have to be able to trace it back to the percepts. I'll go on and we'll get back to this point a couple more times. I've repeatedly made the point to you that sense experience never simply hits us raw, it is always intellectually structured. I agree with this, right? The disagreement is not, I think, where he thinks it is. The ability to have sense experiences at all presupposes our ability to grasp universals. Yes, it presupposes our ability to recognize patterns, in other words. We couldn't have sense experience, it couldn't be interpreted and made into perception, at least, unless it was filtered through a priori faculties that we possess, like causality, like space, like time, and we have to have a repertoire of other qualitative contents, like the form of red or the form of other colors. So, yeah, and the different sorts of lines that can exist, continuity, discontinuity, penetrability, impenetrability, those sorts of things, we have to have built up into us at some level. They have to be hardwired into the brain in order for sense experience to make sense. We get a sequence of action potentials, we convert it into this qualitative phenomenological experience. And so you can't do that without certain universals, something that doesn't originate with experience. If you didn't already have the universal of causality, then an infant could never build from sensation to perception. It could never start to perceive depth and identify objects as the cause of their sensations, because we just get what hits our sense organs, right? That's what immediately contacts us. It requires an inference using some kind of universal principle of causality in this instance. So we are in agreement here. Moreover, all sense experience is particularistic. I never experience rectangularity as such through the senses, but always only this or that particular rectangular object. There is no ability in the senses to abstract from the particular to the general. Not in the senses, no. And I think the sequence of abstraction from the particular to the general that I understand physiologically the best is as described by Jeff Hawkins in On Intelligence. I made a synopsis of that book. You can find it on my channel. I'm not going to rehash all of that, but basically there's some sort of foundational algorithm that follows from the structure of neurons. The fact that repeated firing strengthens a given synapse, and so when you have an input of a sequence, it can trigger a full version of that sequence. Say you learned like a C major scale in the past, and that's in your memory. Those neurons, that connection between certain neurons is strengthened because you've memorized that sequence. Well, when someone starts to play the scale, you identify the whole thing because those already sensitive synaptic connections are ready to be fired, even without the holistic uh, sequence of action potentials being brought to it. Just a part of it will do. And what that allows you then to do is to construct a hierarchy of reference, because in effect, the just portions of a whole sequence can represent the whole. And in a hierarchy of reference, then you can go from the most basic kinds of sequences of sense experience to higher order sequences, patterns that we observe. That all makes sense to me, but even in that account, you do have to have some kind of intuitive connection with the universals that are concerned here, like geometric forms, causality, things of that nature. I've repeatedly made these points to you, and you've agreed with them. What mystifies me is this: what grounds you could possibly have for objecting to any of what I've been saying if you accept these things. If being able to grasp universals is a necessary precondition for even being able to have sense experiences as we know them anyway, then how can sense experience ground our concepts? Because the universals that are foundational to sense experience and perception are not conceptual. They're intuitive. There's a difference between intuitive apprehension of universals and conceptual apprehension of universals. If you want to equivocate between a concept and an intuition, like what's your reason for doing that? I have a concept of a concept that's useful to me because I can see this operation being carried out in my mind. And it clarifies what a judgment is if I treat a concept in this way. If I treat it as like a name referring to some kind of mystical entity that comes from somewhere and enters into my mind in an unspecified, untestifiable way, then I mean, the clear deficiency of that kind of view of a concept is how do you then verify whether a concept is real or not? If I know exactly how it is that a concept is built, then I can reverse engineer any given concept to see if there was an error in its production. If I don't know how it's produced, if it's just like given from the mind of God or something, I can never falsify it. Okay, so you've made a distinction between the universals that you acknowledge to be hardwired into all cognition, yeah, those that are intuitive, and other higher order universals that are not, conceptual. But what reason is there to think that this is even a genuine distinction? Well, because, I mean, developmentally, you don't have high-level concepts until you build to them. You don't have these high-level mathematical concepts until you build to them. Maybe they are there in like the divine mind. You could go into some mystical speculation and say that if your true identity is the divine mind itself, which I might say, then you already know all, mathematical concepts, but they're not intuitive. Right? Infants, the intuitive structures are brain structures. They're things that are hardwired into the architecture of the brain. And that, certain mathematical concepts simply aren't hardwired into the brain. But we can access them by going through a sequence of learning. We have to learn the association between first low-level abstract concepts like numbers, and then build a sequence of abstraction from that, abstracting from different relations and functions up to something like, I don't know, the omega number. But we don't just have that as a concept off the bat. We have to build to it. So that's why it's definitely a valid distinction to make between intuitive apprehension of universals like causality, space, and time, and conceptual apprehension of universals such as we arrive at through mathematics and higher philosophy. And, this just seems obvious to me. And I don't, maybe I'm missing something, is what I'm saying. You've tried to suggest that higher order universals can't be grasped as confidently as the lower order universals that are strictly necessary to sense perception. Well, the grasping of lower order universals simply happens. They could still be wrong, right? But we automatically have concepts in space, time, and causality. Whereas higher order universals, there's more room for error because there's a sequence of abstraction and reference building to them. The higher order the universal, the more likely it is that you made a mistake somewhere along the line because there was a sequence of judgments and a sequence of abstraction leading to it. That we are more likely to be deceived when we reach into the realm of higher order universals. But why? Well, I just said why, because it's a longer operation. Because the higher order universals rely on the lower order intuitions of universals, or rather, I want to say concepts here instead of universals. So yeah, higher order concepts are susceptible to error more so because they rely on the lower order, and there's additional processes cognitively that we go through to reach them. Now, it may be that the higher order universals themselves exist equally from the beginning with the low order universals, but it's a matter of how our minds get to these things. And I do agree that any possible experience we might have of universality already exists. So they are eternally there. We discover them, we don't build them. But the process of discovery is integrated from beginning to end, from being an infant, knowing nothing, or knowing nothing except what comes intuitively built in, to being, an adult with all of the pedagogical background and the different kind of dialectical reasoning processes we learn. So you need that whole process to get to the higher order universal. That's a lot of room for error. Of course, people can make mistakes in reasoning. Rational intuition can sometimes lead us astray and cause us to believe something that isn't true. Yes, but reason isn't any more prone to errors than the senses are. Yes, it is, because reason relies on not just the senses, but on the senses and other basic phenomenological content. We can also sometimes misperceive objects or have hallucinations. What reason is there to think that the senses are inherently more reliable and therefore inherently more worthy to be an ultimate ground to things than reason is? I'm not saying it's the senses. And to be clear, the senses don't misperceive anything. They don't have hallucinations because they're not making causal inferences as to the origin of themselves. Senses infallibly, or rather sense data infallibly is what it is as sense data, right? So perception can be mistaken because the intuitive faculty of causality is strengthened ontogenetically through experiences, and that means that when our sense organs are out of place or their relation to an object mimics some typical relation but differs in a key way, then we can have a hallucination. So if you cross your eyes, you see double. The world isn't really double, right? Well, that's an example of a misperception because the lines of light, like the light path from points on the objects, are hitting different portions of the two retinas than they ordinarily would. Whereas if you were cross-eyed permanently, you would eventually start to see single, because your understanding would catch up. The understanding is not perfect. Even intuitive apprehension of universals is not perfect, which is why we have repeated experiments and scientific methods of validating sense experience. But yeah, the fact is that as you go up in the chain of complexity cognitively into higher abstraction, there are more steps that you go through and more can go wrong. Now, I want to qualify that though, because it is possible that in certain domains at higher levels of abstraction, you find structures that exert a certain kind of like force on you. So once you have a mathematical language, like basically language is this. So once you have a formalized mathematical language, even if it's highly abstract, you can still be very, very sure that you're right because the language itself stores those relations and the language has been built up through many individual contributions and tested constantly, and anything that's wrong in it gets eliminated. So it's more durable. Mathematical language is more durable than just the stuff that you remember in your own personal philosophizing or chains of abstraction. So that's kind of an exception there. But even in those cases, with mathematical language, you can always trace the concept back to its primary ingredients. You have something that's intuitively given at the heart of everything in language, even like the square root of -1 or something like that. It's an operation that we can understand what it is intuitively because it's a low enough level of operation, and then we can't necessarily imagine what comes out of that, but we can understand the ingredient components. So like that's an example of a concept that we can't fully intuit, but we can identify the ingredients of its composition. And then, yes, the phenomenology of perception is indubitable, not of perception insofar as perception infers the existence of objects. The phenomenology of sensation is indubitable. I can't deny that I'm having a certain perception, even if what that perception leads me to believe might actually be false. But the phenomenology behind reasoning is similarly indubitable. I can't deny having had the experience that some particular argument works, even if I happen to have actually missed something or made some subtle error in reasoning. You can't prove logic using logic. We have the intuition that certain kinds of logical relations are true, and we strengthen those or weaken those based partly on the perception of our peers. But the whole stacking problem is still in play here, because in order to have abstract concepts, they had to be built up from something that wasn't abstract. Just historically speaking, that had to have been the case. Not all animals have abstraction and reasoning. Humans do. We did something to achieve this ability. Therefore, that ability was built atop something more fundamental. To anything that's, like in a building, the higher floors are more likely to collapse than the lower floors. If you take the set of all buildings that have sustained damage, more of the higher floors have been destroyed than the lower floors. Because if the lower floor is destroyed, everything is, including the higher floors. Whereas if the higher floors are destroyed, the lower floors are not necessarily destroyed. So you can make mistakes in reasoning, but that won't change your immediate intuitive perception. Whereas if you have a change in your immediate intuitive perception, that will lead to, if you follow through with that, a change in your reasoning. Unless it's very momentary or something like that. I don't see any reason to privilege one over the other. This hierarchical relation is the reason for the privileging. And as far as I can see, you haven't provided any. Well, I have now. So far, this just looks like a prejudice to me. It's true that thinking can be difficult, that ultimate questions about metaphysics, ethics, theology, and so on are difficult, and that we can be prone to doubt when thinking about them, but there's no avoiding this. This is something that everyone wading into these areas must face. Yeah, and I've kind of been arguing the wrong, I'm defending a position I don't hold partly here, because I'm not saying reason itself ought to be held suspect. In the context of this conversation, I'm saying that concepts that don't point to something concrete, and by concrete I simply mean phenomenologically accessible, are not complete concepts. They're not valid concepts. They don't have defined reference. A concept has to refer to something that we have access to in the mind. And so we have to know how it is that the concept is constructed from its ingredients. Okay. In the absence of reasons that don't sound like you're simply repeating your intuitions, declaring the senses to have some kind of privileged position over other faculties for guaranteeing our knowledge and preventing us from being fooled seems like a dodge. Yeah, it's not about knowledge in general. In this, I want to limit the conversation to concepts, because my claim is that you can't break down morality to something based on like the good or even teleology, because those concepts are conceptual. Whereas my breaking it down to an intuition of positive subjective value, now obviously that's conceptually formulated because I'm using language, but we can refer immediately to positive subjective experience. I mean, arguably you could do the same for teleology, but I mean, I think teleology has more baggage, whereas intention doesn't. So it can just be your desire that something happened. That's the kind of immediate intuitive basis for teleology that I would refer back to. you don't want to use more complex concepts than absolutely necessary as the basis of the system. You want something intuitively given and irreducible. Whereas teleology is composed of like intention plus like intrinsic purpose. And intrinsic purpose, I don't think we get prior to language. I think animals simply have desires. They don't know about like a proper, is this the right kind of activity for me being who I am, and am I fulfilling my purpose in life? No, they just have a desire to do something. And that ultimately reduces itself back to positive and negative subjective value. Now he draws this sense, or this rather thought experiment about a mind in a vat, basically a mind in a void, and how it could, just by reflecting on its own thinking, arrive at an ethical conception. Because I was saying, if you don't have positive and negative subjective value, then how can you ever get to ethics? And he was saying that it could recognize teleology. That's where I'm pulling this from, because it could reflect on certain properties of its own thinking. You can read that section in his last response if you choose. So if a mind didn't have experience, this is him quoting me, if a mind didn't have experience of positive and negative value, then it wouldn't be able to form the category good. What would the term good refer to for it? As I keep saying, when questions of this sort come up, it depends on the kind of metaphysical system that we might want to accept, that the mind would be apt to accept. I think that teleology is indubitable simply because all thought is always about something. Yeah, but the aboutness, I don't know if that's honestly intuitively given. I feel like that requires a whole conceptual framework. Thought, like, I don't know, Husserl breaks it down to like this kind of intentional content. And he would agree that thought is always intentional. There's an intentional content, but the aboutness seems a little more abstract, and you would have to build to it, I think. Directedness, teleology, is inherent to reality, and even the kind of disembodied mind that I imagine my thought experiment would be able to notice this. All of the mind's thoughts would be about something, would be directed at some object, and so the mind would be able to notice the role of teleology in reality. Now, the problem is that there's no object for that kind of mind, and any object that's presented to it is presented through perception. I mean, honestly, it seems like you're just taking mature human reason and thought and language and projecting it onto a mind in a vat. But how did this mind in a vat, without any sense experience, without any basic phenomenological content other than pure abstraction and concepts, how did that ever get to a notion of an object? I think this is a serious question. Well, let's look at it developmentally, right? If you took an infant, like when it was still being formed, right when the brain was formed, and put it in a void with no sense experience whatsoever, would that brain start developing along the lines of thinking? I don't think so. Is it intrinsic to the human mind? No, because if you don't teach a kid language, the kid doesn't think linguistically. The way it thinks is fundamentally different. It doesn't think using language. It thinks the way like a chimp does, which is to refer to particular memories and classes of experience. It can have a certain level of abstraction, but it doesn't have a large abstract repertoire because it doesn't have language to like hold on to the things. It seems like an instance is representative of a larger class of instances for a chimp. It's very unrealistic, basically, to say that the mind in the vat would, first of all, be thinking about objects. What objects? Where is it getting these objects from? Seriously, where are the objects coming from? And then it would notice the teleological nature of its own thinking. People don't achieve this level of thinking philosophically, despite the fact of all the other resources they have available. So a mind in a vat just happens to be a philosophical savant. Is it just that like sense experience is holding us back and we would be these perfect philosophical creatures if it weren't for that? I think the only way this works, this kind of brain in a vat, mind in the void experiment, maps onto the way Ivan's thinking, is if it's God. God is that mind in a void in a sense, and he can have observation about, he can derive concepts from the relation of his own thinking because there's nothing outside of his thinking. And so those are, he himself is the groundwork of his own concepts. But that's not the way we think. And if we're going to have a theory of ethics, then the concepts that we have ought to be based on something that reduces to our own mind. Okay, so having done this, the mind could define good in teleological terms. Good would be that which fulfills the mind's telos. In this case, thinking and grasping at the truth. I think my objection to this thought experiment is clear at this point. Where is it getting this notion of truth? Where is it getting the concepts? How is any concept different from any other? What is he referring to? This requires basically like a hotline straight to God, and the ideal forms are being brought before his mind. In what form? It's not clear, because when I try to think of a concept, like visual, tactile, auditory things come to mind. That's the way that I represent abstract concepts to myself, or language. Symbols, which are still represented visually or auditorily. So, like, how is it thinking? You haven't specified that. If you could, in detail, like really take this thought experiment seriously and write as though you were the mind in the void, not using mature language that you've taken from yourself, but like from the beginning, without any language, describe how that thought process would go, how it distinguishes between different concepts and identifies their relations. This notion of good arises out of a metaphysics in which teleology is an inherent part of reality. Ethics and metaphysics are thus integrated here. Do you think that you need to have experience of positive and negative subjective value to be able to grasp metaphysics? If not, then such experience is not strictly necessary to ethics either. I think, in fact, you do have to have experience of positive and negative subjective value. Otherwise, you wouldn't be motivated to engage in metaphysical study. All action, praxeology, you're a libertarian, you know this. All action requires a motive. And in order to study metaphysics, you have to have been motivated by some positive value. Beyond that, I'm a Schopenhauerian, right? Of course, metaphysics requires positive and negative subjective value because metaphysics reduces to the will at a certain level, in my interpretation. And I think, the representation without the will is an incomplete model, and the will without representation is an incomplete model, right? But an integral model of metaphysics does require positive and negative value, in my opinion. But the point that he's making here is that if you just tie the good to teleology, which is discoverable through metaphysics, then you're all set. But I don't think teleology is something that we could apprehend if it weren't for our positive and negative subjective value experiences regarding intention. We derive the concept of teleology from intention. Like not all cultures even have a notion of teleology, which makes it pretty clear that it's a developmentally acquired concept, culturally and individually. It's not just like given to us through pure self-reflection. Sense experience might be necessary to know in particular cases what one must do or avoid doing to achieve one's telos, since that might vary depending on the kind of entity that one is. But arriving at the general concept of good does not require sense experience. Well, in actual fact, every single person who has a concept of good has some sense experience. So the claim that it doesn't require sense experience, like really, with no prior phenomenological material, the like ideal form of the good is just brought before the mind, that seems like you're pulling that out of nowhere. And that's a radical claim in my opinion. Like I do agree that you can like remember anamnesis, the good from the Platonic realm, given a certain set of experiences that leads you to that recognition. You can kind of coincide with the Platonic realm by building up conceptual structures which map onto those higher eidetic forms, which is redundant, but eidoses, I don't know how to pluralize eidos. Experiences of positive or negative subjective value might precede fulfilling or not fulfilling one's telos, but these experiences are epiphenomenal. No, they are phenomenal. They aren't necessary to be able to arrive at and grasp the general concept. And I would just totally disagree. Because how do you define that concept? Like, break down the concept into its ultimate reference. If it's just a word, okay, where is that concept coming from? What are the ingredients of the concept? How can you point to them? If it's not something in the mind, then I can't validate it. I can't falsify it. If you're going to say, I'm getting this from God, well, all right. I mean, Steve on the street screaming at pedestrians can be saying that he's getting messages from God. Am I going to trust Steve? No. You have to have a testifiable process where I can replicate how did you generate this concept. And since not everybody gets to the concept of the telos, I think obviously it requires some more basic, intuitively accessible phenomenological things like positive and negative subjective value to access. And the important thing for our discussion is precisely that good is a general concept which may have different particular instantiations. Yeah, I mean, that's an important thing. So, but how do you get to the good without positive experience? How do you generate the concept? Seriously, how do you do it? Because I know how I generate the concept of good. I can trace it in my mind, and you can trace it, and I can't trace yours. I don't know what yours is, because you're kind of just referring to it as though it just was always from the beginning, but it wasn't always from the beginning in your mind. Insofar as you have access to it, it has an origin. What was the concept's origin for you? If it was reading, then that came from sense experience. If it was, you were absorbing perceptions culturally that have precedence in more basic levels of cognition. But where did the mind get the notion of an object? Where did it get the notion of possession? Where did it get the notion of composition, action, potency? Because he's saying it could contemplate these things a priori. But where did all these distinctions come from originally? As already mentioned, all thought is inherently about something. Even a mind simply reflecting on some metalogical law or constructing abstract arguments with logical connectives and checking them for validity would be thinking about something. When you try to do that, you're thinking about the relation of symbols. You're thinking about the relation of concepts that are represented to you conventionally through symbols, auditory or visually. You can't go through this process without some kind of phenomenological placeholder for it. It has to be built up from something more fundamental phenomenologically. You can't do this. You can't actually just in pure abstraction with no content besides the abstraction itself, engage in all these arguments with yourself and see all the chains of reasoning. That's not how the mind works, and I'm testifying to that based on my own experience. And to me it does seem self-evident, and what I'm asking for is, if you say you have this ability to contemplate pure abstraction without any sense experience mixed in there, without any more basic phenomenological content, how does that work? I can't imagine it, and so I can't validate your concept of a concept. These things would be the objects of its thought. It's not possible to think without some notion of an object. This follows just from the teleological nature of thought. He's using very mature concepts and then putting them on a brain in a void, a mind in a void, as though that would just be self-evident. The notion of composition would also follow from the mind simply reflecting on its own thinking. Every logical or argumentative form that it considers would be composed of some kind of abstract propositions. Modus ponens and modus tollens, for example, have premises and a conclusion. These are all components. Yeah, but it doesn't go far enough, because all of those components are linguistic as you're articulating them here. They're all words, and those words have references. So go back to the most primitive components. Is the definition of that term self-evident? No, it's a term that refers to something else, something outside of language, something sensuous or otherwise, non-linguistically phenomenological. The same goes for the notions of act and potency. Before the mind considers some argumentative form, his consideration of that form is in potency, and when he considers it, the consideration of that form comes to be in act. As a mind reflects on an abstract argument unsure of its validity, the argument is potentially valid. After the mind verifies its validity, it is actually valid. Act and potency, like teleology are just inherent to reality. It's not possible to have thought without a notion of these things. They are not inherent to reality necessarily. You don't know that a priori. You have built to these concepts. And that means that we possess intuitive structures that are capable of building to them, but they don't come mature out of the box. As for possession of properties, in order to be able to think about something, that thing must be describable in some kind of syntax. More than that, it has to be broken down into its most basic linguistic syntactic operators, and those themselves have to point to a prior perceptual syntax, because linguistic signs just pointing to each other in a never-ending chain do not yield meaning. The linguistic meaning comes from phenomenological meaning, which an animal can have, like the meaning of an event for an animal, and not just in an emotional sense, but you have to go lower than just language, because words always have definitions, and those are just other words. So how do you escape that? You have to point to something non-linguistic, some given experience. That can be a priori. I'm saying it can be a priori, but mature abstract concepts are not given a priori. Teleology is not given a priori. You have to build to it through experience. And I would, again, argue realistically, absolutely every concept has to be built to through some mixture of experience and the a priori forms of intelligibility that we are built with. If it is describable in mental syntax, then it is a certain way, and if something is a certain way, then it has properties. God is an exception to this, but God busts all our ordinary categories of thought. This would be true for any other object of thought. Right. And I don't really disagree with any of this as he's putting it, and this is like the process of philosophical thinking, and that's good. But in actual fact, it's built off of something lower than just the linguistic abstractions. It's built off of where do those abstractions come from? Something concrete, something sensuous or otherwise phenomenological. I've repeated that a lot, but it's important. In reality, this is how you get your concepts. Otherwise, the question to you is, how do you get the definition of the most basic concepts that you're using? Where does the definition come from? Where does the meaning of it come from? From an experience, right? And if you're having these experiences of these concepts directly from God, well, fascinating. Describe that process, because I can't describe that process in those terms, or I can't imagine it. These things also interpenetrate. Anything that is composite, for example, also possesses the property of being composed. Anything describable in the language of act and potency, which would be everything other than God, would therefore on that account be composite and would also possess properties and so on. Yeah, so all of this, I don't disagree with the way he's talking about philosophizing, except that it has to be built on something. The definition doesn't just come from nowhere. And hopefully this will make it a little bit clearer. I've kind of mapped out. I can't fit the whole thing. Oh well. So this is my basic schematic of a concept, right? You have multiple events of phenomenological happenings, and in the event, through our intuitive faculty, we identify some eidetic aspect. So pick up any object, right, and its tactile nature, the meaning of that tactile nature as experienced phenomenologically, you can then isolate out from the thing itself. Because you could close your eyes and someone could be swapping out multiple versions of the object, and you would always come back to recognize the same tactile nature. Or something else made of the same material but shaped a different way, you could recognize that same tactile nature, the abstract element of the original evenemential occasion phenomenologically, that recurs. And so we're able to differentiate between this subset of the event and the event itself in its embedded worlded context. We do this for other events, and then, this itself could be a concept, that particular tactile thing. But more likely you have different varieties. Now I've abstracted this tactile experience, this tactile experience, this tactile experience. They're all different, but they are tactile experiences. And so then I hold those tactile experiences against one another in my mind, and then I generate a notion of like a tactile spectrum between hard and soft. And that spectrum then gives definition to both the concepts of hard and soft. And that's how I know what I mean by hard and soft. And so the concept of hard is arrived at, and the concept of soft. Okay, so I understand how that process goes. I understand how a concept is generated in that way. Now with Ivan, concepts are just there forever, or we get them directly from God. And if that's the case, why do we have only certain concepts and not others? It seems clear that there are experiences we have to go through in order to access the concepts. Now, I totally consider it possible that at the moment that the concept is built through a mundane process, it corresponds to a divine equivalent of the concept, right? Like the meeting of heaven and earth in language or something like that. That's totally fine. But in order to validate the concept, this part has to be there. Because this part alone, there's no means of testing it against other people other than appeal to the majority. Just saying like, oh, do you feel that the good means to be altruistic or to fulfill one's proper telos? Like, do you agree? And that's all culturally contextual, and that's why it's a logical fallacy. You don't appeal to the majority to validate concepts. You appeal to something testifiable and demonstrable, something that, you know, you identify all the operations going on in the process of building to the concept. So clearly, we don't have all concepts off the bat. We have some subset of all possible concepts. Why do we have that subset? Why are we able to access a concept? Through some sequence of experience, right? I think Ivan must acknowledge that. But what's the sequence of experience that builds to it? He's not answering that question at all. And I'm saying this is the sequence of experience that builds to the concept. And it has its root at the lowest level in actual phenomenological events. And even the recognition of the concept is itself a phenomenological event, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I mean, it's also possible once you have a concept to abstract from it directly and have higher order concepts and relations up here. I'm moving my mouse outside of the frame, great. So that's also possible, but what you have to do is trace it all the way back down to the original events. Otherwise, where is the concept coming from? That is just not sufficient because it's not intersubjectively verifiable. You have to be able to say exactly how the concept was constructed in order to give it a firm definition, in order for it to be otherwise a valid concept. I encourage everyone to read on the fourfold root because there's a reason I keep mentioning Schopenhauer, and it will clarify your thinking in a lot of ways. I think most people don't have a concept of a concept, and that's why they have, ungrounded, abstract, nonsense concepts all the time. So this is the kind of, we need a groundwork for philosophy, and if you haven't actually read the philosophers, and I know Ivan has, I'm not talking to him now, but like this is pretty foundational, and more like it can be found in the fourfold root. So Ivan, I hope that you understand now where I'm coming from on that. I hope you feel that I've provided an argument at least for the fact that concepts must be grounded in percepts. But it has been a pleasure having this discussion with you. And if you want to reply, reply in this video, as I'm sure you would. And we can continue the discussion. You can clarify anything that I left out or that I'm not understanding about your position. Thank you for listening.